video for our attachment topic. And as you can tell from the picture there, it's all about how an infant interacts with and why an infant interacts with a primary caregiver. So this particular video is going to look at a few things. We're going to look at what attachment is and how we define it. We're also going to look at caregiver-infant interactions, and specifically we're going to be looking at reciprocity and interactional synchrony. These two key elements that involve a primary caregiver and an infant and help bring about attachment. So the first one we're going to have a look at is what attachment actually is, because in your exam you might be asked to give a definition of it or what attachment actually looks like. So attachment is basically a strong, reciprocal, two-way emotional bond between an infant and a caregiver. Okay, and this is something that develops over time. So you've got to get those key words into your definition. It's strong, it's reciprocal and two-way, so between the infant and the primary caregiver. It's emotional. So you've got all these keywords you've got to get into a definition. And we look for attachment when infants and caregivers display certain characteristics. And these characteristics are going to become very clear to you over this topic because we use them an awful lot in a lot of the different lessons that we're going to be doing. These include proximity. So it might be when an infant wants to stay close to the primary caregiver. They show separation distress. So if the mother, for example, leaves the room, then the child might start to cry. Okay, they start to show signs of distress when their main attachment figure leaves the room. But also they use the mother as a secure base, or the primary caregiver as a secure base. And they try and make regular contact with that attachment figure. And you'll see throughout a lot of these videos, I'll be using the words primary caregiver, primary attachment figure, or mother, because it's usually the mother, to help you or tell you what I mean when I'm talking about what a child actually attaches to. So I'll be using those words interchangeably, but they all mean the same thing. So now we know what attachment is. That is that strong, emotional, enduring, reciprocal bond between an infant and a caregiver. We're now going to look at how this starts to form. What's needed in order to start forming an attachment. And we're going to look at two main things. We're going to look at reciprocity and we're going to look at interactional synchrony. And although they're quite long, complicated words, you'll see and you'll be able to recognize these. If any of you have young cousins, young brothers or sisters, you'll be able to tell what these things are quite easily. So the first principle we're going to look at is this idea of reciprocity. And this is basically when a mother or an infant respond to an action of the other one, okay, with a very similar action. So it might be that one day maybe the infant brings about an action or does an action, and that brings about a response from the mother. Or the mother brings about an action which brings about a response in the child. And it's almost as though they're taking turns in the actions. So the mother will do an action, then the child will do an action. Then the child will do an action, the mother will do an action. So the interaction flows both ways between infant and primary caregiver. So for example, if the mother smiled, the child would smile back at them. Okay, that would be an example of reciprocity because they're both taking it in turns. So the next key factor in developing an attachment is this idea of interactional synchrony. So if you break that word down, interaction, so they're with each other, interacting. Synchrony, doing it together. So this is more when they respond in time to each other. And it helps them to sustain communication between the infant and the primary caregiver. And when two people interact, they tend to mirror what the other one is doing. So they'll copy facial movements, they'll copy bodily movements as well. And this could be emotions, it could be behaviours. So you might see, for example, an infant and a primary caregiver being perfectly in time with each other, or as if they were one person. It's sort of like a conversation between the two of them, and they'll be copying each other's facial movements, expressions. This is a bit more of an ongoing interaction between the two. Reciprocity is just copying the facial movements, for example, whereas interactional synchrony is more like a conversation going on between the two of them. Okay, as if they were one person. It's going on back and forth between the infant and the caregiver. And it's exceptionally important for the development of attachment. And if you watch this video here, just click on it, go watch the video for a minute. It shows how this can take part in real life with almost brand new babies. New infants can copy and mirror and go back and forth with a caregiver. Okay, it's a brilliant video. It shows you how attachment starts to form between an infant and the primary attachment figure. So hopefully you just watched that video of the little infant copying the father in the video. And there is one very important study that you need to know which shows how interactional synchrony actually works. And it was by Meltzoff and Moore. And what they did was they had children which were as young as 2 weeks old. And they gave them 4 stimuli. You can see Meltzoff in the picture over here. They gave him 3 facial expressions. One with the tongue sticking out, one with his mouth wide open, one with him puckering his lips like he was kissing. And he also had a hand gesture involved as well. And what they did was they observed the child's responses to these actions. So there are a lot of different behavioural categories, such as tongue protrusion, mouth opening, etc. And then they'd observe and tick off every time the child copied one of these actions. And they found that there was an association between the expression of the adult and the action of the baby. Okay, so the babies were copying the actions of the adult, which shows that this is something children are doing straight away in order to help us try and form an attachment with that child. So we've had a look about what attachment is, what reciprocity is, and interactional synchrony. And now we're going to have a look at how to evaluate this. We're going to look at whether these actual principles exist, is there support for them, is there not support, and try and evaluate this part. So one of the key problems with this idea of interactional synchrony and reciprocity is that it's very hard to know what's actually happening when you're observing young children or babies. Because actions like yawning, smiling, they occur an awful lot in children. And what we're observing might just be their general activity levels. It might have nothing to do with them trying to copy someone's behaviour. Okay, so it might just be general activities and not the imitated behaviours we think they're doing. Therefore, we can't be sure that this reciprocity or this interactional synchrony actually have special meaning. Like in the Meltzoff study, when they were copying their mouth opening or tongue protrusions. We can't be sure that that has a special meaning, or whether that's just general activity that the child would be doing anyway. So we don't actually know what the purpose of these two things are. We don't know why children are doing reciprocity. We don't know why they're doing interactional synchrony. So although we can maybe tell that they are happening, we can't really tell why they're doing them. However, there is a strength of Meltzoff's study, and that's that it was a controlled observation. So this allows us to capture an awful lot of detail. And usually, because it's controlled, we can observe it from many, many different angles. So we can really get a good idea of what the child is doing during that observation. And another benefit of a controlled observation, especially using babies, is that they don't care that they're being filmed. Okay, so their behaviour shouldn't change as a result of being filmed. Whereas in adults, we get things like social desirability, bias or demand characteristics. With babies, we don't get that. So overall, the fact that we can capture a lot of detail, view it from multiple angles, the fact that a child's behaviour isn't changed, increases the validity of this particular piece of research. So one of the major problems with this Meltzoff and Moore study is that it potentially lacks reliability. There have been an awful lot of attempts to try and reproduce the findings of this study, and they've always been a little bit unsuccessful. For example, Kopke tried to replicate the exact same study and failed to get the same findings. Children weren't imitating the facial expressions as found by Meltzoff. However, Meltzoff said that the major issue with Kopke's study was that it wasn't controlled properly. Okay, maybe they weren't using the same behavioural categories. The fact that other parts of the study weren't controlled as well, and that's why they didn't get the same findings that Meltzoff did in his initial study. So although the studies do lack reliability, Meltzoff and Moore do put out some defence for why they found what they found.